2 hours, that's all it took. Central Command confirmed it completed what it directly called a heavy wave of strikes against Iran at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, and in that single 2-hour window, American forces hit dozens of targets across the country, including military command centers, missile and drone production and storage facilities, coastal surveillance and defense sites, and maritime capabilities up and down the coastline. This came just hours after President Trump told a Fox News reporter in almost shockingly blunt language that Iran was about to get, in his own words, a beating, adding that the United States was going to hit them very hard because, as he put it, standing in the Oval Office, it's our turn to hit them and they know it's coming. Within hours of that promise, explosions were being reported across multiple locations in southern Iran, and by the time the strikes wrapped up, Iranian state media was already reporting civilian deaths, while Iran's Revolutionary Guard confirmed several of its own personnel had been killed as well. Brent crude oil, the global benchmark that the entire planet's energy markets watch like a hawk, jumped more than 7% in a matter of hours, crossing $90 a barrel, a direct and immediate signal of just how seriously global markets are taking this latest escalation. This is not a rehash of an old strike. This happened within the last day, and it marks a dramatic return to open combat after a brief pause that everyone, apparently including Iran, badly misjudged. To put that 7% jump in perspective, oil markets don't move that violently over rumors or vague tension. They move that hard when traders genuinely believe physical supply through one of the world's most important energy corridors is at real risk of disruption. And that's exactly what's happening here, because this latest wave of strikes did not stay contained to a single front. It landed in the middle of a rapidly expanding regional standoff that, within the space of about 48 hours, has now pulled in Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia alongside Iran and the United States, each one absorbing strikes, launching retaliation, or getting caught directly in the crossfire. That is the actual scale of what unleashed hell looks like in practice right now, not a single night of bombing in one country, but a chain reaction spreading across half a dozen borders in under 2 days. So let's talk about why this specific round of strikes matters so much more than just another night of bombing in an already brutal war. Because the context surrounding this particular escalation is what makes it genuinely different from everything that came before it. This conflict didn't start with this week's strikes, and it didn't even start with the 2-week bombing campaign that preceded them. This entire war traces back to late February, when a joint Israeli and American military operation killed Iran's own supreme leader at his compound in Tehran, an act that instantly transformed what had been years of shadow conflict and proxy warfare into a full, open shooting war between Iran and two of the most capable militaries on the planet. Everything that has happened since then, the naval blockade of Iranian ports, the repeated waves of nightly strikes, the tanker seizures and cruise missile attacks in the Strait of Hormuz, the bridge and infrastructure campaigns, all of it flows directly from that opening moment. Because a regime that just lost its supreme religious and political authority to an enemy strike does not simply negotiate calmly afterward. It fights to prove it can still survive, and that's exactly the pattern this war has followed for months now. One dramatic escalation after another, briefly interrupted by fragile pauses that keep collapsing under their own weight. The United States had actually halted its strikes on Iranian targets several days earlier, pulling back after roughly 2 weeks of continuous nightly bombing, specifically to give diplomats what officials described as some space for peace talks to actually breathe. That pause was a real gesture. It wasn't nothing. It represented an actual attempt to step back from the edge and see if a negotiated path still existed. And Iran's answer to that gesture, according to the American account of events, was to launch more than 30 separate IRGC-directed aerial drone attacks against American forces in the region within a 72-hour window, followed by an attempted ballistic missile attack directly targeting a U.S. base in Jordan. American defenses intercepted that missile attack before it could do damage, but the intent behind it was unmistakable, and it was that intercepted attack specifically that triggered everything that followed. So when people ask why the United States abandoned a fragile peace window this fast, the honest answer, sitting right there in the reporting, is that Iran apparently used the pause not to negotiate in good faith, but to reload and test how far it could push before the retaliation train started moving again. And now we're going to break down exactly what got hit. Who else got pulled into this fight within the same 48 hours? Why the city of Qeshm Island became the center of one of the most tragic and disputed casualty claims of the entire war, and where the involvement of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan, and now even the Red Sea shipping lanes signals this conflict sliding toward something far bigger than a two-country fight. Stick around until the end for the roundup on the Houthi blockade of Saudi Arabia and the quiet diplomatic maneuvering happening in Lebanon right now, because both of those stories are moving in parallel with everything happening inside Iran, and neither one is getting nearly enough attention given how much they could shape what comes next. Let's actually rewind and walk through the sequence properly, because the order these events happened in tells you almost everything about how deliberately this escalation was built rather than stumbled into. The 2-week bombing campaign that preceded this pause had already been one of the most sustained aerial assaults of the entire conflict. Night after night of Central Command strikes grinding down Iranian military infrastructure across the south and center of the country. When that campaign paused, it wasn't framed as an ending, it was framed explicitly as space for diplomacy, the kind of deliberate operational pause militaries use when there's a genuine belief that talks might actually produce something. That's an important distinction because a ceasefire born out of military exhaustion looks very different from a pause born out of diplomatic optimism, and this was clearly the latter. Within days, though, American officials say Iranian-backed forces launched more than 30 drone attacks against American positions across the region in a single 72-hour stretch, an intensity of harassment that made it obvious Tehran had no intention of using that quiet window to actually de-escalate. Then came the move that changed everything, an attempted ballistic missile strike aimed directly at American forces stationed in Jordan. A ballistic missile attack on an active American base is not ambiguous. It's not a proxy skirmish that can be waved away as militia freelancing. It is a direct, unmistakable act of war against American personnel, and American forces successfully intercepted it before it could cause casualties, which honestly may be the only reason this entire story isn't being told with a very different, much darker headline right now. President Trump's reaction to that intercepted attack was about as far from diplomatic language as a sitting president gets on live television. Speaking to a Fox News correspondent, he didn't dance around the moment at all, promising the country was about to get, in his exact words, a beating, and telling reporters directly in the Oval Office that it was America's turn to hit back, and that Iran already knew it was coming. That kind of blunt, almost personal framing from the commander-in-chief matters, because it signals this wasn't going to be a quiet, measured, proportional response, calculated purely by military planners behind closed doors. This was a publicly telegraphed promise of overwhelming retaliation, made before a single American bomb had even left the bay of an aircraft, and it set expectations for exactly the kind of heavy wave that Central Command delivered hours later. When CENTCOM's statement went out confirming the operation had wrapped up, the language used was notably broad, describing a very wide target set rather than a narrow symbolic strike list. Command and control centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance and defense installations, maritime capabilities along the coastline. That's not a warning shot. That's a comprehensive effort to degrade Iran's ability to keep fighting across multiple domains simultaneously, land, sea, and the drone and missile production pipeline that has kept this entire war grinding on for months. Now here's where the story gets genuinely painful, and where the honesty check has to come in immediately rather than waiting until later, because the human cost of this specific round of strikes is already deeply contested. Iranian media reported that a couple and their 2-year-old child were killed when the residential building they were living in was struck on Keshem Island, the largest island in the Persian Gulf. Iran's Revolutionary Guard separately confirmed 3 of its own personnel had been killed in the American strikes. On the surface, that might look like a straightforward set of casualty figures, but notice what's actually happening in that reporting. Iranian state media is emphasizing the family, the toddler, the residential building, framing the strikes around civilian tragedy, while the IRGC's own statement emphasizes military personnel losses, a completely different framing aimed at a completely different audience. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. A family can have died in a residential strike, and IRGC personnel can have died in a separate strike on a military facility the same night. But the way each fact gets surfaced and which one gets amplified depends entirely on who's telling the story and what they want the world to feel. Bombings were also reported in the southwestern cities of Avaz and Abadan, with Iranian outlets reporting resulting power outages in Avaz specifically. None of this has been independently verified by neutral third parties yet, which is worth remembering every single time a fresh casualty figure gets attached to a strike that happened less than a day ago. Wartime reporting in the first 24 hours is almost always incomplete, sometimes exaggerated in one direction, sometimes minimized in the other, and the full picture usually only comes into focus days or weeks later, once independent journalists and satellite imagery analysts get a chance to cross-reference the claims coming out of both sides. It's also worth pointing out that the United States military has not, at least publicly, disputed the core claim that a residential structure on Keshem Island was hit, which is a meaningfully different posture than simply denying civilian harm outright the way militaries sometimes do in the immediate aftermath of a strike. Central Command's own language has focused almost entirely on describing the target categories it says it hit: command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance sites, maritime capabilities, without directly addressing the specific residential building claim at all. That's not confirmation, but it's not a denial either, and in the fog of a war moving this fast, Silence on a specific claim often just means official battle damage. Assessment hasn't caught up yet, not that the claim is automatically false. If you're watching this story develop over the coming days, that's exactly the kind of detail worth tracking. Whether the Pentagon eventually offers its own account of what happened on that island, or whether it simply lets Iran's version stand unchallenged in the public record. But the retaliation didn't stop at Iran's own borders. And this is the part of the story that should genuinely worry anyone tracking how fast this conflict could spiral beyond a straightforward two-country confrontation. In the same window, American and Saudi fighters struck multiple logistics and weapon sites belonging to Iran-backed militias across eastern Iraq, a direct response, according to Central Command, to that same wave of more than 30 IRGC-directed drone attacks against American forces over the preceding 72 hours. The Popular Mobilization Forces, a coalition of mostly Shia, largely pro-Iranian armed factions operating inside Iraq, announced that several of their headquarters had been hit and that multiple members had been killed, immediately labeling the strike a highly dangerous escalation and a direct violation of Iraq's sovereignty. And this is not just angry rhetoric from a militia group. Iraq's own prime minister has reportedly directed the country's foreign ministry to pursue legal action against both the United States and Saudi Arabia over the strikes. A genuinely significant diplomatic escalation, because it means a sovereign government, one that is nominally a partner rather than an adversary of Washington, is now formally treating an American-led strike on its own soil as a violation worth pursuing through international legal channels. That's not a footnote. That's a sitting government putting on the record that American operations crossed a line serious enough to warrant a legal response. And it's exactly the kind of secondary consequence that turns a bilateral war into a much messier regional entanglement. Iraq's position here is genuinely uncomfortable. And it's worth understanding why, because Baghdad has spent years trying to walk an almost impossible line between Washington and Tehran simultaneously. American forces maintain a real military presence inside Iraq, cooperating with the Iraqi government on counterterrorism and regional stability, while at the same time, Iran-aligned militias operate openly within Iraqi borders, wielding enormous political and armed influence that the central government in Baghdad has never fully been able to control, let alone eliminate. Every time American or Saudi strikes land on Iraqi soil targeting those militias, Baghdad gets put in an impossible position, forced to publicly object to a strike carried out by one of its most important security partners, while privately fully aware that the militias being targeted operate largely outside its own actual control. Pursuing legal action is, in that context, less about genuinely expecting a courtroom outcome and more about Iraq trying to preserve some shred of sovereign credibility with its own population, who understandably don't want to watch foreign militaries repeatedly bomb targets inside their country, regardless of who those targets ultimately answer to. And it didn't stop there either. Hours after the American strikes on Iran concluded, both Jordan and Kuwait reported being hit by Iranian strikes of their own on that same Thursday, with Kuwait confirming at least one person killed. Think about what that means practically. Within roughly a 24-hour window, we saw an intercepted Iranian ballistic missile attack on Jordan, American and Saudi strikes on Iranian-backed militia targets inside Iraq, a heavy American strike wave across Iran itself, and then Iranian retaliatory strikes hitting both Jordan and Kuwait in return. That is not a two-sided fight anymore. That is a rapidly widening regional conflict now actively touching at least 5 different countries within a single rolling news cycle, and every one of those countries has its own domestic political pressures, its own economic exposure through Gulf shipping and energy infrastructure, and its own reasons to either escalate further or desperately try to pump the brakes. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a warning in the middle of all of this, cautioning that a prolonged conflict risks drawing in the wider region, which honestly reads less like a hypothetical warning at this point, and more like a description of something that's already actively happening in real time. Let's actually dig into what Iran's response has looked like beyond the physical strikes, because the rhetoric coming out of Tehran right now is worth understanding on its own terms. Iran's Revolutionary Guard publicly vowed to punish the aggressor, language deliberately left broad enough to apply to the United States, Saudi Arabia, or really any country participating in strikes against Iranian or Iranian-aligned targets. The Guard also doubled down on a claim it has repeated throughout this entire conflict, insisting it maintains full control of the Strait of Hormuz and warning, in almost theatrically defiant language, that a stranger who has come from thousands of kilometers away will not be allowed to interfere. That specific phrase, a stranger from thousands of kilometers away, is worth sitting with for a second because it's a deliberate framing choice. It's not describing the United States as a rival superpower or a hostile occupying force in strictly military terms. It's framing American involvement as fundamentally illegitimate by geography alone, an outsider meddling in a regional waterway that, in Iran's telling, simply isn't America's business to control, regardless of how much global shipping and energy commerce actually depends on it staying open. Whether or not you buy that framing, it tells you exactly how Iran wants this narrative to be understood by its own population and by sympathetic audiences abroad. Not as a war over compliance with international shipping law, but as a story of a foreign power that has no business being anywhere near the Gulf in the first place. Now, let's get into the analysis of where this could realistically be headed, because there are some genuinely serious voices weighing in publicly on exactly that question right now. Retired four-star General Jack Keane argued directly on air that the United States needs to use military force to reopen the Strait of Hormuz if negotiations with Iran continue to fail, framing it in blunt terms, saying that if diplomacy can't get it done, force has to. Keane specifically pointed to Iran's ballistic missile attack on the American base, its repeated strikes on Gulf shipping, and the ongoing pattern of attacks carried out by Tehran-backed militias as clear evidence that diplomacy, in his assessment, is unlikely to produce an acceptable outcome at this point. And critically, Keane wasn't calling for another limited, symbolic retaliatory strike. He explicitly called for a comprehensive campaign, one that would include isolating Iran economically and logistically by closing its roads, railways, airports, and ports, essentially choking the country's ability to function as a connected economy, alongside what he described as all-out attacks, specifically targeting the IRGC and its leadership structure directly, plus sustained pressure on Iran's remaining ballistic missile and drone production capabilities. That is a dramatically more aggressive posture than anything that's actually been implemented so far, and the fact that a retired general with this level of credibility is publicly advocating for it on national television tells you that this idea is very much part of the live policy conversation happening in Washington right now, not just fringe commentary. Separately, retired Vice Admiral Robert Harward, a former deputy commander of Central Command, offered a different but equally important observation, arguing that pressure is genuinely building against Iran on multiple fronts simultaneously, not just militarily, but diplomatically. He pointed specifically to Saudi Arabia's direct participation in the recent strikes as a significant shift, noting that Riyadh, joining American operations against Iranian-backed targets, represents a real change in how openly Gulf Arab states are willing to align themselves against Tehran. He also flagged developments up in Lebanon, where the Lebanese government has reportedly reached an agreement with Israel aimed at undermining and ultimately weakening Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful and most heavily armed regional proxy force. On top of that, Howard noted that Britain has signaled willingness to contribute naval vessels to the ongoing blockade effort, and that additional countries are showing willingness to move against the Houthis as well. Taken together, that's a picture of Iran's entire regional support network being squeezed from multiple directions at once, not just its own territory getting bombed, but its closest proxy relationships in Lebanon and Yemen simultaneously coming under pressure from different coalitions, while more countries quietly line up behind the effort to keep Gulf shipping lanes open by force if necessary. And that brings us to the part of this story that deserves a full breakdown of its own, because it's happening almost entirely outside the direct US-Iran exchange, but is deeply tied to it. The Iran-aligned Houthi movement in Yemen announced a blockade against Saudi Arabia back around July 20th, and that move has expanded this entire conflict's economic footprint into a second critical waterway, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, alongside the already heavily disrupted Strait of Hormuz. Shipping traffic through both of those choke points has slowed dramatically as a direct result, which means global energy and cargo shipping is now being squeezed from two separate strategic pressure points simultaneously, rather than just one. That's part of why oil prices reacted as violently as they did following this latest round of strikes. It's not just that Iran and the United States are trading fire again after a pause. It's that the entire architecture of Middle Eastern maritime trade, both of its most important choke points, are now under active threat at the same time. And markets understand exactly how serious that combination is, even if the average person scrolling past a headline doesn't immediately grasp the connection between a strike inside Iran and the price they'll be paying at the pump next month. To really understand why this two choke point squeeze matters so much, picture the map for a second. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, and it's the route almost every tanker loading oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iran itself has to pass through to reach open ocean. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait sits much further south, at the narrow gap between Yemen and the Horn of Africa. And it's the route ships have to take if they want to reach the Suez Canal and continue on toward European and Mediterranean markets, without sailing all the way around the southern tip of Africa. Historically, these have been treated as two separate risk zones by shipping insurers and energy traders, each with its own set of tensions and its own periodic disruptions. Having both of them simultaneously under active threat, one from direct Iranian military action and one from an Iran-aligned proxy force, is a scenario energy analysts have quietly worried about for years, without actually expecting to see it play out in real time. Insurance premiums for vessels transiting either route have reportedly spiked as a result, and several shipping companies have already begun rerouting or delaying voyages rather than risk sailing through either corridor while the situation remains this unstable. A decision that adds real time and real cost to global supply chains, regardless of whether any individual ship actually ends up getting targeted. Let's talk honestly about where Iran actually stands militarily at this exact moment, because after months of sustained bombing campaigns, command centers destroyed, missile storage sites hit repeatedly, coastal surveillance systems degraded night after night, it would be easy to assume Tehran is on the verge of total military collapse. That assumption doesn't match what's actually happening on the ground. A country that has been under this level of sustained pressure for months and is still capable of launching more than 30 coordinated drone attacks in a single 72-hour window. Still capable of attempting a direct ballistic missile strike on an active American base, and still capable of hitting back at both Jordan and Kuwait within hours of absorbing a heavy American strike wave, is clearly degraded, but very much not disarmed. That distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to predict what happens next. Degraded means slower, less coordinated, more vulnerable to precision strikes, and increasingly reliant on asymmetric tactics rather than a conventional military response. It simply can no longer sustain. It does not mean finished, and it certainly doesn't mean incapable of continuing to inflict real casualties and real economic disruption for months to come if this current trajectory holds. There's also a domestic angle to Iran's calculus that's easy to overlook when you're only tracking the military side of this conflict. A regime that has already lost its own supreme leader to an enemy strike, that has watched its coastal infrastructure, bridges, and missile stockpiles pounded night after night for months, and that is now watching its own currency and economy strain under the weight of a renewed naval blockade, faces a genuinely difficult internal question about what continuing to fight actually buys it versus what standing down might cost it politically at home. Regimes that back down completely after this level of sustained pressure often don't survive the domestic backlash that follows, especially when hardline factions within their own military and clerical establishment are already primed to view any concession as betrayal. That internal political reality is a big part of why so many analysts, including the ones cited earlier warning that Iran may be moving further away from diplomacy rather than closer to it, don't expect a clean negotiated resolution anytime soon, regardless of how much additional military pressure gets applied from the outside. So, where does this actually leave things heading into the next several days? Based on everything reported in just the last 24 hours, the trajectory looks like an active, rapidly escalating conflict rather than anything trending toward a genuine de-escalation. The brief pause that existed just days ago has now completely collapsed, replaced by exactly the kind of heavy retaliatory posture the American side explicitly promised before it even happened. Iran's Revolutionary Guard is publicly signaling more retaliation is imminent rather than any interest in stepping back. Saudi Arabia's direct military participation alongside the United States marks one of the most significant expansions of the coalition actively opposing Iran throughout this entire war. Iraq's government pursuing legal action against both Washington and Riyadh introduces a genuine diplomatic complication that didn't exist a week ago. And with both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait now simultaneously under pressure from Iranian and Houthi actions, the economic stakes of this conflict have officially expanded well beyond a regional military confrontation into something with direct, immediate consequences for global energy markets and shipping costs everywhere. Voices like General Keane are already pushing for an even more comprehensive campaign than what's currently underway, while officials like the UN Secretary General are warning that the entire region risks getting pulled deeper into this with every passing week that a genuine off-ramp fails to materialize. What do you actually think happens from here? Does this latest heavy wave of strikes finally push Iran back towards serious negotiations? Or does it just confirm what a lot of analysts have been warning for weeks, that Tehran has effectively decided diplomacy isn't worth pursuing anymore and is committed to grinding this fight out for as long as it possibly can, regardless of the cost to its own military and civilian population? Drop your prediction in the comments, because opinions on where this goes next are genuinely split right now among people who follow this closely. And honestly, the range of takes is worth reading through if you want a fuller picture than any single analysis can give you. If this breakdown helped you actually understand the layers behind today's headlines, instead of just the scary explosion footage circulating online, go ahead and hit that like button, because it genuinely helps analysis like this reach more people who are trying to follow what's happening, rather than just react to isolated clips out of context. Share this with anyone who's been asking what's actually going on with Iran, Iraq, Jordan, and Kuwait, all getting pulled into the same headline cycle over the last day, because most quick news alerts don't have the space to connect all of these pieces together the way we just did here. And make sure you're subscribed because given how fast this exact situation has already flipped from a hopeful diplomatic pause to a heavy retaliatory strike wave within the span of a single week, there's every reason to expect the next major development is closer than anyone watching this conflict would like it to be. Thanks for sticking with this one all the way through, and we'll see you in the next breakdown.